All right, well, let's open up to Ephesians, if you would. Open up to Ephesians with me. We're in Ephesians 5, verse 6 this morning. And that's our entire passage, our entire text for this morning, just one verse. We've been in this little subsection of Ephesians 5 that's all about purity of behavior, purity of action. And here in verse 6, some commentators say this is kind of the exclamation point of that section. I know if you've got a paragraph Bible, you can see that it begins a new paragraph. Some people would say, of course, and the translators or the printers of your Bible would say that it's probably the first thought in the next paragraph or the next main point. I'm not really sure which one I agree with more. I think Paul just kind of meanders through his arguments, and this one is kind of like a hinge verse. It sort of summarizes the previous paragraph, and it also sort of introduces the next paragraph. So I figured we'd just treat it by itself all at once. And there's a lot here. You know, I almost thought about turning this one verse into like a 4-week series because there's so many implications that just unfurl from this one verse. But I exercise restraint. We need to finish Ephesians at some point. And if I keep doing 4-week series out of single verses, we'll never finish it. So we're going to do it all in 1 week here in the next 35 minutes. And I've got some points here. Let me read it first, and then I'll kind of explain it and tell you how I'm going to work through it. Ephesians 5, verse 6, he says this: "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience." Let no one deceive you with empty words. What I'd like to do with the next 35 minutes is actually sort of break this sermon up into 2 parts. Usually I'll work through the text, explain it, and offer application within those explanations as we work through the text. But because it's so short, I think what I want to do is just explain it, explain Paul's intent, the meaning that's infused in these words, and then I want to make some very pointed points of application for us that we can take away and apply to our lives in light of this verse. So kind of a 2-part sermon. The first part is just explaining the text, and then I'll give our 3 points of application toward the end. So first, let's just look at the verse. Look at the actual construction and the grammar of the verse here. Paul writes, "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience." Let no one deceive you. This is a warning from Paul, a stark warning. Let no one deceive you with empty words. That first phrase could be more literally translated, let not anyone deceive you. Let not a single one deceive you. The defenses of the Ephesian Christians were to be on high alert. They were to batten down the hatches and let not a single person infiltrate their defenses, ideologically speaking, and deceive them. This sort of phrasing should bring to mind an intense defensive posture. It's an extreme guardedness, a weariness toward outsiders with different ideas about things. And that's the idea here. Paul's calling upon the Ephesians to put up their guards and to be vigilant and to monitor what influences their thinking. He knows how influence works. He understands how thinking is developed and changed over time. It doesn't happen in a controlled environment with a healthy, open debate between clearly opposing parties. That's not how change in thinking occurs. It always occurs in the context of confusion and disorganization, doesn't it? Who has ever sat down and thought to themselves, in a moment of sober clarity, I'm going to change my mind today about some core doctrine. I'm going to change what I think about truth today. I'm going to alter my worldview at the core principles which have guided my life so far. No one does that. No one sits down and thinks, I'm going to alter the trajectory of my thinking today. That's just not how it works. If someone's mind is going to be changed on fundamental truths, it always happens slowly and in the context of confusion. That's how it works. Sometimes someone will come into your life, into your social circles, and they'll gain some level of trust. And then, when they think the time is right, they'll introduce new ideas, and then they'll frame them as attractive and based in a new sort of logical consistency that makes sense. Just think of Peter's warning in 2 Peter 2, verses 1 through 3. Peter warned the dispersion this, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies. Secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves, and many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of the truth will be maligned. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep." That's a warning from Peter to the dispersed Jews in the area, and I think it is a poignant warning that has a lot of bearing on how Paul is warning the Ephesians here as well. That's how doctrinal and ideological drift happens. It's secretive. Secretly introducing destructive heresies is how Peter phrases it. It's a sort of sneaky process of gaining trust, then quietly introducing destructive ideas to be considered and tasted and then swallowed before the hook is finally set and there's no way out. And so here, Paul's warning the believers in the church at Ephesus to be on guard for that sort of deceptive strategy. He's telling them the playbook of the other side. He writes, "Let no one deceive you." And then he specifies the tools of their trade. Look at it there. "Let no one deceive you with empty words." The Greek word which we see here as empty is the word kenois. It communicates the sense of void or absence of substance. That's what that word communicates. When it's used with the word like logos, which is words here, empty words, kenois, logos, it means that just what we see here, empty words. Words without value, void of value, without substance, deprived of truth, in other words. Words that are meaningless when it comes to objective truth. The idea is that these words peddled by the empty talkers are completely devoid of Christ and Christian truth. They miss the mark of orthodoxy, and so they're useless to teach what's true. They're just a waste of breath. Actually, they're worse than a waste of breath. They're like toxic emptiness in your breath. That's the vision here. That's what's going on. I was recently reading about this scientific experiment as we as a country were preparing to go to the moon. This was, I think, 1960s, mid-60s, and they were testing the first spacesuits. And so they were testing these spacesuits, and they would put a man, well, first they started with just the suits and like dummies in them, in a vacuum chamber, and then they worked their way up with confidence to put a man inside the spacesuit, and then they took all of the air, sucked all of the air, all of the oxygen and everything else out of this vacuum chamber. And there was a man in here, and then a few seconds in, this was one of the first tests on a human being in a spacesuit. Something happened with one of the valves that fed him his pressurization, and it leaked slightly. And they detected it immediately and said, "All right, abort, but it takes 30 minutes for the vacuum chamber to repressurize." And obviously they didn't have 30 minutes. And so they were as fast as they possibly could repressurizing the chamber. And this man, there's a YouTube video of it. You can see it. It's fascinating to see. And he describes the feeling that occurred. The guy survived, by the way. And so I should probably have started with that. And so he's in there and he feels the valve fail and he feels himself being exposed to a complete vacuum, the first time a human being has ever been exposed to a complete vacuum. And what he feels was, they talk about the boiling of your liquids within your body. And he describes, he says, he passed out within about 5 seconds of this happening, but he remembers those 5 seconds, and he describes it as he's falling back. He describes the saliva on his tongue boiling and bubbling. Fascinating stuff. The guy somehow survived. They repressurized the chamber as fast as they possibly could. They had a guy in a I don't know what they call it, an antechamber, like a secondary partially pressurized chamber right next door, and he just opened the door. And so like the pressurization flooded in, and I think that helped have him survive. I'm not a scientist. Go fact check me on all that stuff. The point I want to bring up is that when all of substance is removed, the environment is dangerous. That's what Paul's talking about here with empty words. These are words that are in a vacuum. There's a vacuum of truth when it comes to these words. And if you expose yourself to this environment for long enough, you're tempting fate. A valve might break. You're an experimental scientist if you're dabbling in empty words. And we know here that it never ends well. Contrary to how we dealt with spacesuits, we figured out how to fix them, and now they're pretty reliable. But when it comes to empty words, a vacuum of words, when there's no truth, there's just danger. Just danger. There's nothing to protect you from it, ultimately. The idea is that these words peddled by these empty talkers are just vacuums of truth. They're toxic in their emptiness. That's how deceivers work. That's what they do when they do their work. They inject nothing. It's a nothingness. And oftentimes it looks substantial. It looks like it might make sense. But when you compare it to objective truth, it's meaningless. Words which have no real substance of truth, and they can morph to fit any sort of person and their desires. That's how deception occurs. These empty words can be shaped into anything just to make them more attractive and palatable, but in the end, they lead to the same destructive end. And just because the words are empty, it doesn't mean that they're not harmful. You know, some people can read this passage and think, well, it's just empty words. They're just kind of like nothing, right? They're neutral. No, that's not the vision here. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying because they're empty, they're dangerous. That's what's going on in the grammar here. If we allow ourselves to get comfortable in the vacuum chamber, eventually something will give. Some hose will break. Some commitment to truth will fail. And it all comes crumbling down and we get boiled from the inside out. And so here in Ephesians 5:6, Paul's warning the people in the church to be on guard against this sort of thing. He's just gone through a whole section prior to this verse on the impurity of behaviors of worldly people. And now here he's saying, don't let that poison into the church. Don't allow the cancerous ideologies which run rampant out in the dark world under the power of Satan make its way into your fellowship. Don't let it happen. Let no one deceive you with empty words. And the second half of this verse sharpens the warning by pointing to the consequences of failing to heed it. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. The ultimate result of letting someone deceive you with empty words is the consequence of receiving the wrath of God by being counted among the sons of disobedience. That's what he's saying. To be enticed by empty words such that you fall into empty thinking is to ultimately prove the natural end for someone who is a son of disobedience, an unbeliever. The end result is the proof of the primary cause, unbelief. And I'm convinced that that's what Paul's saying here in this verse. He's warning the people in Ephesus to keep a close watch on their rules of engagement when it comes to empty talkers. Because while it's true that no genuine believer can lose their salvation, it is possible to lose the next generation if you allow these empty ideologies to take root in the church. I mean, play hypothetical with me right now. If all of us, true believers, firmly committed believers, who cannot ultimately become sons of disobedience again, if we were to just abandon this exhortation from Paul, what would happen? Well, we may become wayward in some of our thinking, but we can never lose our salvation. What would happen is this church would fail because the next generation would be caught up in the vacuum. They would be the ones who fall. If we're not doing a good job of protecting the pressurized chamber of the church, it can all fail. He's saying don't allow this deceitful talk into your community because there's some in your gathering who are not yet securely saved. Your children and some of the newer folks are still learning the basics and they're still learning what it looks like to be a genuine believer, what the core fundamentals of the gospel are. They're prone to falling prey to these sorts of ideological cancers, which are brought into the church by deceivers who are bringing and using empty words. So the end result of failing on this point is that the wrath of God will be meted out upon those who prove themselves to be sons of disobedience by falling prey to the empty words. And the wrath of God is nothing to take lightly. I mean, just listen to how Paul describes the wrath of God in Romans 1. Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. He describes their sin in detail in this passage, and then again he comes in and describes the end result, that God's response to their sin. Therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their heart, to impurity. This is God's wrath, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served a creature rather than the Creator, who's blessed forever. Amen. That's the end result of being a son of disobedience. The wrath of God directly applied to you. It's the product of empty thinking, falling prey to empty words. If you fall into empty thinking, you bring upon yourself the wrath of God. It's as simple as that. That's what Paul's saying here in this verse. It's serious. It's supposed to be a sober warning to the people in Ephesus, the Christians in Ephesus. All right, now if you'll let me, that was me explaining the text. Now you get the sense of it. You understand the meaning, the intent to the church in Ephesus. What I'd like to do with the rest of our time is draw out 3 points of application in light of this. 3 practical takeaways which we can apply to our lives today as we seek to do what Paul exhorted here for the Ephesians to do. They're these. First, cultivate a deep commitment to truth. Second, beware Satan's strategies. And third, practice earnest self-discipline. Cultivate a deep commitment to truth, beware Satan's strategies, and practice earnest self-discipline. This is how we do what Paul encourages here. But first, cultivate a deep commitment to truth. Now, I'm convinced that this is one of the best, if not the best, strategies to defend against bad ideologies. Cultivating a deep commitment to truth. If we want to do what Paul says here in Ephesians 5:6, let no one deceive us with empty words, then first and foremost, we need to cultivate a deep, robust, thorough commitment to truth. This is how we fight error, with truth. By tethering ourselves to truth, anchoring ourselves to truth. And as I was thinking about how to make this argument and put this before you, a few subpoints were formed in my mind as I was thinking through this. I've got 4 subpoints here for how to cultivate a deep commitment to truth. Don't chuckle at me. Subpoints are good. I'm going to have subpoints on subpoints if you keep laughing. Here are 4 ways by which we should cultivate a deep commitment to truth. The first is this: know truth. Know it. We as believers are a lot of things, aren't we? We're a people of love. We're a people of compassion. We're a people of humility. We're a people of worshipfulness. We're a people who are defined by many aspects of our character as Christ followers. But I think that the number one characteristic of a believer isn't any of those other things. It's that we're people of truth. That is a defining, probably the most defining feature of a Christian, of a believer. It's truth. Or else what is it you believe in, right? Belief has an object. You see, we understand that truth is something that's defined by God's perfect revelation. Truth is objective fact anchored to God's own self, ultimately seen by us as his creatures in every aspect of reality that's derived from God, right? This is how we make sense of anything in the world. This is how 2 + 2 = 4 is truth, because that is derived by God's character. He created the moral fabric of the world. He created every sort of fabric of the world, the scientific fabric of the world, just the material that even we exist in. The fact of gravity, the law of gravity, only makes sense if you understand truth objectively. Truth is objective and derivative of God. We discover it using our minds as we read his special revelation, the Bible. We test it as we engage in scientific endeavors. We learn it as we push the limits of mathematics and see how all the numbers make sense and they make these beautiful patterns together. We know truth and we love truth. Christians are the greatest defenders of truth, knowers of truth. Our entire worldview and the way of thinking is defined by truth. Without it, we're just lost, like the rest of mankind. We can grab little bits of truth as we see them. God, in his common grace, allows lost man to understand some semblances of truth. That's why there are secular scientists who can figure out and test and theorize and write down objective truth. But they ultimately don't have the worldview that's given to us by the Holy Spirit to interpret that ultimately leads us back to God. as the definer of the truth in the first place, the giver of the truth. Without it, we're just as lost as mankind. How does Jesus describe himself in John 14:6? He declares, I am the way and the truth and the life. And guess what? No one can come to the Father but through the truth. John 1:17 tells us that the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. Just up the page from our passage here in Ephesians 4, verse 20 and 21, Paul writes, but you did not learn Christ in this way, if indeed you heard him and were taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus. In John 8:32, Jesus makes it even clearer that we must know truth. He says, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We're people defined by truth because truth is what made us believe in the first place. And truth is what we believe and what we hold to and what we continue to believe in now. We're not just those who have believed, we're believers. We continuously believe. There's no such thing as a Christian who doesn't know truth. We as a people are a people who are inherently born in truth, steeped in truth, growing in truth, and committed to truth. And all of this means that we need to take care to hold to that truth. We need to let our knowledge of truth inform our disposition to the outside world, which doesn't have the same relationship to truth as we do. Colossians 2:8. This is the verse just before what Jack read this morning to set us up. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy. Actually, this is the next chapter after what Jack read. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, and not according to Christ. See to it that no one takes you captive through that philosophy, that empty talk, the vacuum of reality. We should be a people who are deeply committed to pure truth. We should be people who love truth. We should love truth to the point that we are completely intolerant of anything but truth. I don't have a problem with us even being known for having a ferociousness in our commitment to truth. We defend it with assertiveness and consistency. That's what makes us truth tellers and truth believers. We don't compromise on our commitment to truth. We could never even think about compromising on our commitment to truth because we love it so much. It's just not a part of our worldview. That's what a believer is. 2 Timothy 4, 3-4, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and they will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. There's coming a day, and I would argue that we are in that day now, where people just want myth. They don't want truth. By and large, that characterizes this world, doesn't it? We can't be swept up in that if we're tethered to truth and decidedly uninterested in newfangled theories and novel doctrines. And we don't want our ears tickled, right? We just want truth. Give me the truth. That's what makes us who we are. In the end, we're people who need to know truth and have that knowledge of truth influence everything we think and do. But we can't just stop there, right? A simple knowledge of the truth isn't enough to effectively stave off ideological attacks from the world. We need to know truth, yes, that's step one. I think we also need to study truth. This is our second subpoint under the first main point of cultivating a deep commitment to truth. Know it and study it. Every one of us should be committed to the perpetual investment of growth in our knowledge of truth. This is something that also characterizes a believer. We shouldn't be content with just knowing the most basic truths and stop there. And that's because those most basic truths are the sorts of truths which pull people in to learn even more and more and more about truth as we contemplate them, right? This is the beauty of the gospel. It enlightens us to understand even more truth. The gospel's simple. It's simply the set of truths that God is the creator of all things, therefore owns all things, and demands perfection of all of his creatures. And he himself is perfect. And then we fail to meet that standard, of course. And so we're in this helpless state of depravity, deserving of hell. But then Christ, who is God, died an atoning death on the cross to pay our sin debt on our behalf. And anyone who truly and wholeheartedly believes in Christ, his death and resurrection, will be saved from eternal punishment in hell to spend eternity with Christ. That's the core truth that we need to understand to be saved. That's the gospel truth. That's what one must believe to be in this category of truth believer. That's how we get here, the truth by which we're born again. But once we're here, we're born into a new appetite for truth. More truth. Give me more of it. I can't wait to learn more. That's what a believer is. We're to have an insatiable appetite for more and more truth. Think of 1 Peter 2:2. Like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. We love the word. We crave the word. I don't know if we can extend it too far and cry if we don't have the word like babies. That's probably too far of an illustration. Peter didn't mean that. But you get the idea, right? We need it. It's our main function. Colossians 1:9-10, this is what Jack read a little bit earlier. We have not ceased to pray for you and ask that you may be filled with the full knowledge of him, of his will, in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you may walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, and multiplying in the knowledge of God. What is that? Multiplying in the knowledge of God? It's taking your knowledge of God and exponentially increasing it constantly throughout life. That's the Christian life. That's the life of a truth lover, a truth knower, a truth studier. The life of a believer is a life that's characterized by constant growth in knowledge of truth. And here's an important thing to know. While we're all called to be a people of pure knowledge without foreign additives, we're not called to be a people who just put blinders on our eyes and only consider the official teachings which we've already come to accept and outright reject all other ideas that get even near us, right? That's not what we're called to do. We're not to have these philosophical blinders that just cause us to ignore all truth claims in the world. We're not to accept what we consider to be right and then never consider any competitive ideas, ever. That's not what Paul is calling us to. That's not the call of a serious believer. There are people out there who think that any idea that they hear from outside their pastors in their local church must be heretical. That's a real sentiment. If it's not taught by my pastors, then it's not true. Now, I appreciate loyalty. I respect the sentiment of trust and allegiance to the shepherding role of the local pastors in your church. It's a good thing to be weary of ideas that you've not heard your pastors teach. But that can be taken too far. What I mean by this is that it's possible to become so committed to our predetermined positions on doctrines and such that we lose the ability to reason and think for ourselves. That's not what any of us as pastors want for anyone in this body. We try to teach you to go to the Word yourself and understand what's true, not just trust us that we did all the work for you. Now, we do try to be trustworthy and do all the work for you, but we try to lead you to the water so that you can get it yourself. We're not to be a people who, when we encounter a truth claim that's new or different to us, we just revert back to whatever our Ryrie study Bible says. And whatever it says right there underneath the text, that's what I believe. Or the MacArthur study Bible, whatever it believes right there, whatever it says right there, that's what I believe. That's not how intellectual full thinking is. That's not healthy. There's a difference between being confident in one's understanding of and commitment to truth and being closed-minded to the point of being myopic, short-sighted. That's not what we want. It's cultish to have a set of beliefs and then be so closely closed-minded and committed to those particular beliefs to the exclusion of even entertaining or understanding or engaging with other ideas that you lose your ability to critically think. That's not what Paul's calling us to here. It's the mark of a cult to refuse to consider truth claims outside of already accepted doctrine. And inversely, I would say it's healthy to be so confident in our thinking and in our doctrinal commitments that we're not threatened when someone brings up an idea that we hadn't considered before. Oh, interesting, I've never heard that doctrine explained that way. Now this is probably internal dialogue, I'm not threatened by this because I'm so sure about what I believe. I've done the work. But I would love to trace this out and figure out how you got there so that I can know how to shepherd my own family better, even protect my own way of thinking better. That's healthy critical thinking, engaging, understanding, but still being committed to truth and never wavering on truth. I think of the Bereans in Acts 17. They're a good example of this disposition that I think Paul is exhorting us to have. In Acts 17, when Paul and Silas went to Berea to preach the truth, the Bereans responded to this new teaching by testing it according to the scriptures to see if it was true, right? Acts 17:11. Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, these Bereans, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. And therefore many of them believed, along with not a few prominent women and men. That should be our response to all teaching that we encounter. Any sort of truth claim that we ever encounter, even the teaching we hear in this church. Don't just believe what we say wholesale and without discernment. Don't have blind trust in any human. Test every notion and every teaching by examining the truths daily to see whether they're true. I think we ought to take challenges to our belief structure as opportunities for study and fortification and growth, not putting up walls and never engaging with anyone who thinks slightly differently than us. That's going to make us stronger ultimately in the end. If we were a church filled with critical thinkers who could engage with novel ideas or different ideas and refute them and not be threatened by them, that makes us stronger. Not just building up a massive wall that, if some threat could get over the wall, would just wreak havoc on us because we're weak inside it. We are the defense. Understand critical thinking. Study truth. A third point on how to cultivate deep commitment to truth would be to propagate truth. And this one's quick. Just continue the propagation of truth down through the lineage, down through your family line, across boundaries in your household, across the church, across your coworkers. Propagate truth. 2 Timothy 2:2. And these things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. The propagation of truth. Entrust the truths that you've been given to others. As Paul was exhorting Titus in Titus 2:1 to teach the next generation of believers in Crete, he wrote, "But as for you, Titus, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine." One of the fundamental purposes of a believer is to pass along his belief to others, to share the truth that changed his life. Propagate truth, defend truth. Don't ever fall away from truth. And that leads us to our last little subpoint here under the first main point. Defend truth. Defend truth. Jude 3, contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. Contend for it. Contend earnestly for it. 1 Peter 3:5, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that's in you, yet with gentleness and fear. That's the verse that's the seatbed of apologetics. Apologetics, to make a defense, to make an apology, a defense for what you believe. It's not ultimately aggressive in the sense that you take the fight to them. It would be evangelistic. That's a different category. Apologetics is simply, when asked, be able to explain yourself. Be able to defend the truth that you hold. If you don't know how to defend it, do you really hold it? That's what Peter's getting at there. All right, that's how we cultivate a deep commitment to truth. Now, quickly, I want to get into the second point here. Beware Satan's strategies. Cultivate a deep commitment to truth and beware Satan's strategies. Often when I'm preaching through Ephesians here, I read Martin Lloyd-Jones's sermons on Ephesians, and I really appreciated this paragraph from him as he was talking about this issue in this verse. Let me just read it to you here, and this is 100 years ago. Think of how little has changed. There's a new tendency in life to explain what used to be called sin in terms of variations from the normal, or in terms of disease. The whole idea today is that there's no such thing really as sin, and that we must not say that people who follow certain practices are sinners. We're told that we must recognize the fact that we are not all identical, and that a man does a certain thing because that is his makeup. Fundamentally, of course, we are all the same. But when we come to look at ourselves in detail, we find that there are variations in temperaments and in other respects. One man is active, another man's lethargic, one's mercurial, and one is phlegmatic. Another is intelligent than another. One is more emotional than another. One is more highly sexed than another. Essentially, all men are made up in the same way, but there are variations within the normal. This kind of distinction is being pressed hard all along the line. The man was born like that, and therefore he's just to express himself. And if he does not express himself, he's guilty of violating his own being and personality. Let me ask you, are the empty ideologies that we face today really much different than what Martin Lloyd-Jones faced with his congregation? Not really. I mean, this is just empty ideology born out in our modern world. We are told constantly by the world around us that what we call sin is really just natural urges and innate desires which are good to express. Why would I have that desire if God didn't put it there, if it wasn't good for me to pursue? If we're plugged into the world's messaging, we're fed a constant diet of programming that teaches us that morality is malleable. It's flexible and situational and subjective and ultimately determined by some sort of inward moral compass that directs us to love whatever it is that we naturally love and pursue whatever it is we naturally want. We're told by the world that our view of right and wrong is archaic and marginalizing, maybe even racist. Everything's racist these days, right? Truth is racist. We talk about this at our men's conference just a couple weeks ago. The world around us would love to see nothing more than a wholesale erosion of our commitment to biblical sexual ethics. That's what the world wants out of us. The world wants to see God's design for male and female abandoned in the church. Satan's strategizing to infiltrate our ranks with empty words, empty ideologies, vacuumatic philosophies. He wants to see our households crumble. He wants to see our churches falter. He wants to see us become infatuated with the approval of the masses. He wants us to become compromising in the name of tolerance and acceptance. He wants to erode our commitment to truth. And he wants to do it not by making a full frontal attack on us, but by winning the hearts of the weaker minds in the church. He creates this worldly culture, which is attractive to those of us who've neglected to love truth to the point of developing a deep and robust familiarity with it, such that we could spot a counterfeit a mile away. If we're not pursuing and pressing in on our knowledge of truth, we're susceptible to lies. And Satan knows it. That's his strategy. That's his dominating strategy throughout history. Just read the Bible. It started in Eden, and it's continued the same strategy ever since. That's how local churches implode. That's how their lampstand is put out. That's how our lampstand will be put out if we're not doing what Paul commands here in Ephesians 5:6. We'll either dwindle to the point of closing our doors and selling this property, or we'll go woke, and we'll get swept up in the ideologies, the empty ideologies of the world around us. We'll still have warm bodies filling these rooms in the auditorium, but we'll have compromised the gospel so much that Christ will have snuffed out our lampstand and allowed us to devolve into meaningless religiosity. That's how churches die. They forget to be tethered to truth and never waver on it. And all of this leads to the practice of earnest self-discipline. In the end, right thinking that doesn't produce right practice is not right thinking at all. That's why I've titled our series through Ephesians, Orthodoxy and Orthopraxy, because that's Paul's main point. If you know the doctrine and are committed to the doctrine, straight doctrine, you will have straight practice. Orthodoxy, orthopraxy. They're connected. You can't have one without the other. And here, he's making the same contrast in terms of empty words, empty thinking, and full thinking. He's exhorting us to live and think fully. So this introduces us to the next section, at the same time culminating the previous section. We'll get into all of the derivative things that Paul wants us to think about here in the next few weeks as we look on into verse 7 and down in Ephesians 5. But this is the main point. We need to not allow empty, vacuumatic thinking to permeate these walls, to permeate our minds, to permeate our households. Rather, we need to embrace full thinking, critical thinking, a defense that is confident, a defense that is steeped in our tether to truth. Let's pray. O Lord, you are perfect and good, and you define truth and give us truth. May we hold to it. May we honor you in it. In your name, amen.